Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, today we're going to take a look at a video that is actually covering a topic that I have done some original content on myself. If you saw it a couple of years ago, I did a video called 1776, the year America was born and nearly died. And that was actually based on a message that I had delivered to a gathering of the Sons of the American Revolution. And I took that half-hour or so speech that I gave there on the year 1776, which covers mainly the Battle of Long Island, the fight in and around New York, but also covers the events that came before and after that, right up to the Battle of Trenton. So if you want to see that, I will put a link up at the end as well as down in the description. But I saw that Extra History was doing this video on the Battle of Long Island, so I thought it'd be a great chance to take a look at one of the moments that nearly doomed the very brand new American Republic. So I'll put the link down in the description to the original so you can check it out without my commentary. Let's dive into this one.
Howard's Tavern, Long Island, New York, August 27th, 1776, 2 a.m. William Howard wakes to find, a British soldier standing over his bed. The redcoat orders the young American to get dressed and marches him downstairs. In the taproom of his family's tavern, William discovers his father, William Howard Sr., standing with 3 more British light infantrymen, their bayonets fixed. 2 British officers are present, and though one wears a cloak, William's father's pretty sure he recognizes him. He is Sir William Howe, Commander-in-Chief of the British forces. Howe asks for a drink of liquor from the bar, and Howard provides. He then questions him about the road beyond the tavern, a low trail through the hills named Jamaica Pass. But more than that, he now requests that the Howards guide the vanguard of his army along the pass.
So one of the things that I'm so glad it's getting more attention these days is the incredible role that scouts and spies and intelligence played on both sides during the American Revolution. We got a glimpse of that with the TV show Turn: Washington Spies, which is fantastic, by the way. It plays fast and loose with some of the truth as far as the real history, but it gets a lot of the major events right, and it largely, I think, does justice to the Culper Ring. But there's so much of that was going on that you don't hear a lot about. And you don't hear, we hear a lot about a few of the people that were hanged, like John Andre for the British, or who's the famous one for the Americans, Nathan Hale. But there were so many others that were executed, including 2 of my own ancestors. That's why I know so much about that story. But this is such an important aspect of all of that, is that learning where the passes are, especially when you're the British Army and you're kind of the invading army in a place where it's home territory for the people that you're fighting.
At first, they refuse, but finally Howard Sr. agrees only after they threaten to shoot him. So reluctantly, they set out, leading the column of British troops through a moonless night. And through Jamaica Pass they march, around the flank of the Continental Army, the rebels unaware that 10,000 redcoats will descend upon them with the coming Long Island dawn.
And not the last time that George Washington's forces will have that exact move pulled on them. It'll happen to him again at Brandywine a year later.
This historical close shave is brought to you by Henson Shaving, who we thank for supporting this episode. By the summer of 1776, it appeared as though the American Revolution was on the cusp of success. After the British evacuation of Boston in March, there was almost no royal presence remaining in the colonies between Georgia and Massachusetts.
That said, and I cover this in my video, and if you do end up watching that, you're going to hear me share a lot of the stuff that otherwise you might hear in there anyway. But George Washington didn't have any illusions that the British were gone. He knew they were coming back, and he was almost certain that they were coming back to New York City. It was important for a number of reasons. It's a large city. It's an important port. It's at the mouth of the Hudson River, which would effectively, control of the Hudson River would effectively cut off the New England colonies from the rest of the colonies. And understand it, at this point, the war is pretty much a New England thing. Most of the troops that have been involved have been from New England. It hasn't really spread to the rest of the colonies, and so there's a mindset among the British that if we can take New York, if we can take the Hudson River Valley, we can isolate the problem, and we'll put this thing down pretty quickly. So Washington understood that, and he sends Charles Lee ahead of him down to New York City to start preparing plans for defense of the city.
And Whig revolutionaries controlled the levels of power like the militia and the courts. But even the most ardent American patriot acknowledged that King George's response to such a usurpation was unlikely to be meek surrender. Their fears were well-founded. In July 1776, a British fleet of over 100 ships appeared off the coast of New York City.
32,000 troops in New York Harbor. There's a song called Right Hand Man in Hamilton that introduces this part of the story. They say British Admiral Howe's got troops on the water. So Richard Howe is the admiral commanding the fleet, and his brother William Howe is the commander of the army, the ground forces. And together they're going to come in. And Richard, I think, is actually the kind of the overall guy here in all of this, but William's the guy on the ground. And right as Continental Congress is declaring independence, this massive 30,000 man army shows up in New York City. And that doesn't sound like a lot, especially if you're used to things like the American Civil War. But 30,000 troops is the size of the combined forces for the largest battles of the American Revolution. Most of these battles, you're talking about 8, 10, 12,000 troops on a side.
It was King George's answer to the humiliations of the past year. The British seized Staten Island almost without a fight and began landing troops. The primary objectives of their commander, Sir William Howe, were to destroy the main Continental Field Army under George Washington, seize New York, and then open peace negotiations with the cowed and beaten colonists.
Yeah, and Howe had permission from the Crown to negotiate, and there does end up being a negotiation, which I'm sure they'll get to, but there's not really a lot for them to talk about.
The Continentals prepared to resist. George Washington kept the main body of his army on Manhattan, then known as York Island. However, a strong detachment of 6,000 men were deployed over the East River to Long Island, where they occupied good defensive positions on Brooklyn Heights and the Heights of Guam.
So the idea that they come up with is kind of a precursor to the idea of defense in depth that you hear later, where you're going to kind of fight a falling back battle, and you're just going to win a battle of attrition, because you know you can't go toe-to-toe with the British. But you had seen what you had done back at Bunker Hill in Massachusetts, where you could inflict heavy losses on the British, even if you ultimately are overwhelmed by their forces. And that's what they're thinking here, is that we're going to fight street by street if we have to, and we're going to so wear down the British, and we're going to inflict so many casualties that they're just not going to think it's worth it.
In late August, the British and their Hessian allies, German troops hired by the British, began to ferry across from Staten Island to Long Island. But the Continentals made little effort to resist their landings, deciding instead to remain entrenched on the high ground, with Washington arguing the British presence on Long Island was a feint designed to draw his troops away from New York. But over the space of several days, Howe assembled around 20,000 troops on the southwestern edge of Long Island, while the Continentals still stubbornly kept to the heights. Remembering how, the year before, a similar strategy at Bunker Hill had inflicted massive casualties.
And this makes sense. And when you're in a situation where you know you are the inferior force, you have to take any advantage you can. It makes sense for Washington and his army to do this. The problem is they don't factor in the British being able to figure out a way to outflank them. And the British are going to end up launching this feint. I think it's General Grant's division that's going to kind of offer a frontal assault while the main body goes around. And I want to say that was that Clinton that commanded? It's one of the future commanders-in-chief.
On British attackers. But it's important to remember that back then, the British had marched like little clockwork toy soldiers, in close, slow formations, into a hail of American gunfire. Though the ground had been taken, General Howe knew he could not afford to pay such a high price for another victory. So
Yeah, so Hal was at that battle, but he wasn't in command. That was still Gage at that point. But now Hal has been given command, and now he's going to do things differently.
in the years since, he had developed new tactics for combating the rebels. The British would no longer attack Continental defenses head-on, instead conducting wide flanking movements and rapid bayonet assaults, ensuring the enemy didn't have time to employ their superior firepower.
Right.
Long Island was to be the first.
Well, I don't know if they had superior firepower, but when you're dealing with weapons that take a significant amount of time to reload, the bayonet becomes a powerful weapon.
Test of these tactics. Howe himself would lead the flanking force, which included the elite light infantry and grenadier battalions, Scottish Highlanders of the Black Watch, and the 33rd Regiment of Foot. Two of Howe's subordinates, General James Grant and Charles Cornwallis, were to command the remainder of the army, with orders to mount diversionary frontal attacks. August 26th, 9 p.m. The British camp. 10,000 British flanking troops march away with their campfires still burning to help convince the Continentals they were bedding down for the night. Confined to rough, narrow tracks, the column stretches for over 2 miles. They cross the first major obstacle, a bridge over Goose Creek, without meeting resistance. 11 p.m. west of Guan Heights. Pennsylvanian Continentals unwillingly spark the battle after they take aim at several redcoats foraging in a watermelon patch near the Red Lion Inn. Within 2 hours,
Shot while going after the watermelons.
a British battalion drives into the Continental pickets near the inn and begins to move up the Gowanus Road towards Brooklyn Heights. Grant's diversionary attack is underway. Thinking the British plan is to cut off the heights of Guan from the west, a large force of Continentals take the bait and move to meet Grant's attack. Major General William Alexander leads the defense, with the Continentals meeting the British and Hessian advance from hilltops and ditches. One promontory, the highest point on the west of Long Island, becomes a scene of fierce fighting, as both sides race to secure it. Grant is an aggressive commander, and while he actually launched his assault too soon, the intensity of the action does help convince Continental commanders that his is the main British attack, while...
Yeah, and that's what you want, right? I mean, that's the balance you have to strike as the commanding general of a feint, is we have to not fully commit our troops to where it's a disaster because you're launching a frontal assault, and the point is to not get torn up launching a frontal assault, but it's got to be enough that it's convincing. So it works here. You want to see a great example of a feint gone terribly wrong for a number of reasons. Look at the Battle of Fredericksburg. Everybody talks about Fredericksburg and that disastrous repeated waves of assaults on Marye's Heights. Well, the assault on the Union right at Marye's Heights was supposed to be the feint. That wasn't supposed to be the main attack. The main attack was supposed to be the Union left breaking through Stonewall Jackson, and they did break through. George Meade's division breaks through, but he doesn't get the support he needs. And so while they're not breaking through because that coordinated assault didn't happen properly, the feint turns into a general frontal assault that has disastrous consequences. So you can see how it can go very badly if it's done wrong.
In reality, Howe's knockout blow is winding up 4 miles further east. August 27th, 2 a.m., Jamaica Pass, east of Guan Heights. Having entered their tavern and press-ganged the Howards into guiding his main force, as we saw at the beginning of this episode, Howe and the British column enter Jamaica Pass. The advance, however, feels torturously slow. Repeatedly, the whole long, winding column has to halt while engineers saw down trees to widen the trail for the artillery, axes being forbidden for fear their sound might alert the rebels. The steep, forested sides of the pass seem perfect for the American riflemen the British have heard so much about. Heck, even Howe himself feels sure he must be walking his troops into some sort of ambush. Yet,
So rifles are a thing at this time, but they're fairly rare. They're not standard issue for soldiers on the battlefield. Most of them have smoothbore muskets, which means once you get past like 50 or 100 yards, they're pretty inaccurate. That's why you pack yourself into dense formations to consolidate your firepower and make it more effective. But there are riflemen, and in particular, you have things like the Pennsylvania long rifle and later the Kentucky long rifle. So you have those grooves that cause the projectile to spin and it gives it a little bit more accuracy, which allows you to fire from range.
No riflemen appear. No sharpshooters haunt the looming darkness beneath the trees, for the attention of the Continentals has been drawn further west onto Grant's attack. The British Dragoons surprise and capture the 5 Americans guarding the pass without even firing a shot.
5
How
people.
strategic boldness pays off. After 2 tense hours of traversing the pass, the British emerge onto the Bedford Road, running parallel to and behind the rebel lines on the heights of Guan, now to their south. And having spent 9 hours total marching through the dead of night, Howe permits his men to lie down and rest in the field beside the road. 9 a.m. Bedford, north of Guan Heights. Washington has arrived from New York, drawn by reports of the developing engagement, but he is still unaware that his forces have been outflanked.
One of the reasons I continually say that George Washington was not a great general in terms of tactical ability on the battlefield, but he was a great leader of men, is because of battles like this. He shows that tactically his mind is not necessarily that of a great battlefield commander, but he makes up for that with other qualities that he has.
A further diversionary force of British and Hessians, commanded by General Cornwallis, begins to press the front of the Continental lines at Flatbush Pass, running through the center of the heights of Guan, contributing to Grant's diversion further west. It seems certain the main British force is still south and west of the heights, not to the north. And at the same time as Washington arrives on the scene, Howe orders the 2 light cannons at the front of his flanking force to fire. It's the signal that the real attack is underway. 2 Continental rifle regiments are the first to discover the trick. They mount an ad hoc defense of the walled fields and small forests and orchards near the hamlet of Bedford, and even manage to ambush a company of British light infantry, but they are soon outflanked and scattered. Panic takes hold, and the main Continental line crumbles.
And this will not be the last time that you have a great deal of panic during the battle for New York.
Rolled up from east to west. Cornwallis's corps presses their advantage from the front, with both British and German troops relying on rapid movement and use of bayonets, not giving the Continentals a chance to reform their lines as they're driven from Bedford Pass and the Guan Heights toward the Brooklyn Heights and the East River beyond. The only stable part of the Continental line at this point is on the right, the furthest from the British flanking move. And almost until the end of the battle, this mixture of Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvanian regiments are unaware of the disaster unfolding on their left.
Well, they're going to be aware, and especially those Marylanders are going to end up being key in all of this, because what you're going to see, and this is one of the reasons why I say that Washington makes up for his tactical inabilities with other qualities, is that time and time again you have the perfect combination of Washington's tenacity and not giving up, and the exact opposite happening from Howe and the British, where they fail to capitalize on opportunities to destroy Washington's army.
As they fight to hold Grant's aggressive diversion at bay, believing they are checking the main assault. By the time General Alexander realizes the entirety of the line he'd thought was anchoring his left flank is collapsing, it's almost too late. He orders a retreat through a wide mill pond and marsh spreading from Gowanus Creek, now the only route out of British encirclement. Alexander then commands Smallwood's Maryland Regiment to act as a rear
Maryland
guard,
400,
numbering only around 270 men. Though now often erroneously known as the Maryland 400, they launch a...
This is one of the epic stories in the history of the American Revolution that very few people know a lot about. It's one of those like last stand events that goes down in the lore of the American military. And unfortunately, you know, we don't have the area preserved for the most part today because it's on Long Island and it's in the middle of Brooklyn, and you know there's houses there now, but I think there is a small memorial there somewhere.
Counterattack against the oncoming British and Hessians, led by Alexander himself. They mount multiple bayonet charges against overwhelming numbers. The regiment is decimated and Alexander himself captured, but their sacrifice is not in vain, for most of Alexander's division makes it across the Gowanus. 2 p.m., Brooklyn Heights. Any Continentals not killed or captured flood into the second line of defenses, located atop the Brooklyn Heights overlooking the ferry to New York.
And this is that defense in depth I talked about. This is where Washington has planned a series of places where there can be strategic withdrawals. Well, right now your back is against the East River. So, you've got to hold out until you can get across the river. And this is one of those moments that could decide the fate of the war if Washington can't get his forces back across. And the British screw up.
Here they rally, while the artillery crowning the fortifications opens fire on the pursuing enemy. Though the inexperienced rebel gunners send their round shot shrieking over the heads of the British rather than scything into their ranks, it is enough to make the nearest of Howe's forces take shelter in a roadway cut into a dip in the ground at the foot of the heights. A short, sharp debate follows about whether to continue the assault. Howe wants to end it, but one British officer, in the heat of action, is said to have, quote, stormed with rage at being stopped. But Howe remained adamant. He will not risk snatching defeat from the jaws of victory by attacking Brooklyn Heights.
And remember, what's his experience? He was one of the generals on the ground during the Battle of Bunker Hill. He saw the British forces get torn to pieces in a victory in taking that hill. He is not wanting to have the same thing happen again.
Even now, the memory of Bunker Hill is still too fresh. And by 3 p.m., the Battle of Long Island was over. For the Continentals, the situation appeared desperate. They were essentially besieged on Brooklyn Heights with the East River to their backs, though Washington refused to despair. The day after the battle, he actually reinforced the heights from across the river. Then, on August 29th, Washington held a council of war, and after a debate, did a bit of a 180 and ordered a nighttime evacuation. This maneuver was every bit as fraught and daring as Howe's flanking march.
So one of the things you'll have happen here, and this won't be the last time, is you have this guy, Colonel John Glover, who, if you've ever seen the movie The Crossing with Jeff Daniels starring as George Washington, the guy who plays Glover's fantastic. I love him. He's just like this really irritable, angry guy who just rubs everybody the wrong way, but in the end is a very capable and effective commanding officer. And he's got experience with these boats, and he's the one that's going to get them across the East River under the cover and protection, I believe, not only of night, but some very well-timed weather. And then he's going to be the same guy who gets them all across the Delaware River for the attack on Trenton a few months later.
Under the cover of darkness, the stranded revolutionary divisions were ferried by platoons and companies across to the safety of New York. Disaster even seemed certain when a mistaken order saw the rear guard march down to the boats, leaving the defenses entirely unmanned. Yet fortune favored the bold. Though the sun began to rise while the evacuation was still underway, a morning fog helped conceal the final withdrawal.
Huge.
And the British...
it would be impossible if you're the Americans to see that and not think, God's on our side. He gave us fog right when we needed it. You're going to see that as like a good omen, and those are the kinds of things that are going to keep you going.
Awoke the next morning to find the fortification on Brooklyn Heights wholly deserted. Now, Howe's failure to carry on and destroy Washington's army during the Battle of Long Island has been cited as one of history's greatest military blunders. But in truth, the reality is more complex than that.
Yeah,
the British and Hessian troops were exhausted, hungry, and low on ammunition after marching all night and fighting for most of the day. The cornered Continentals had found themselves in an excellent defensive position.
And not only that, but it's important to point out that while it had been a disaster that day, the overall casualties, even with the captured and the killed and wounded, everything for the Americans are only about 10% of their force. So they've still got a good 9,000 men, 9,000 men in position for this fight. And while the British still have far more, they've got 20,000 available at the moment. It could have been really bloody. So I think he's got a point here.
With artillery and redoubts atop the heights, and continuing the attack would almost certainly have turned the initial battle into a second Bunker Hill. As for the Royal Navy's failure to cut off the Continental escape by river, well, the winds were against the British ships that night, keeping them out of the East River. And even if they had overcome nature itself, they still would have been scoured by Continental artillery and riflemen from both Long Island and Manhattan. Not to mention, if the British had destroyed the Continentals on Brooklyn Heights, it wouldn't really have been the decisive victory Howe sought. Contrary to common belief, most of the revolutionary forces were stationed on Manhattan, not Long Island.
I think that was true initially, but I'm pretty sure Washington brought more over, so I want to say the number's a little more than 6,000 at that point.
Howe knew this was only the start of the campaign, and he couldn't afford to squander men so early on. The British, for their part, would continue to pursue a war of maneuver, outflanking the Continentals repeatedly, first at Kip's Bay, forcing Washington to evacuate New York itself, then at Pell's Point.
So Kip's Bay is really interesting. This is it's in Manhattan. It's not like down at the tip where the Americans had crossed. It's up further, and they come in and they land, and it's this overwhelming disaster for the Americans. A lot of the Americans who are defending there don't even have muskets. They're fighting with like pikes and pitchforks and stuff like that. And you have this really scary scene where an officer describes how the Hessian troops would kill Americans and then cut off their heads and put their heads on pikes and march with those, as like instilling fear into these citizen soldiers who are mainly militia and aren't really trained soldiers. And it was just a rout. And as they're running from Kip's Bay during this overwhelming landing, which involves a massive barrage of artillery, it's like reminiscent right out of something you'd see on D-Day, where you just hammer the defenses and then land a bunch of amphibious forces. It's in this point that Washington rides up, and Washington was known to have a temper. And he slams his hat down, and he's got a sword in his hand, and he's like, are these the men with which I am to defend America? Like, he's just beside himself. He can't figure out how to get these men to fight. But yeah, they're just dealing with so much. And so Kip's Bay is a disaster, and so it's once again falling back.
Which led to the abandonment of Manhattan. The Continentals won their first victory in the field during a large skirmish at Harlem Heights, but withdrew afterward to White Plains. And the campaign culminated in the British and Hessian storming of Fort Washington on Manhattan, one of
Huge
the worst
disaster.
Continental defeats of the war.
Fort Washington, Fort Lee, I mean, that could have been the end of Washington's army right there.
That winter, George Washington force-marched through the rain and ice of New Jersey and into Pennsylvania, his army reduced to just a few combat effectives. Howe's campaign had been an almost complete success, though Washington himself had escaped. His army had been all but destroyed, and the popular opinion was that the revolutionaries would now open up peace talks.
Yeah, in fact, there was a peace negotiation, and I covered that in my video. You've got guys like John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. They come and meet with the House, and basically they're told, well, we have the power to give pardons, and that's about it. And Adams is like, well, and Franklin, these guys, they're like, well, we haven't done anything we need pardoned for. So if you're just here to offer us pardons, we have nothing to talk about. And it ends with really nothing happening. And that happens right in the middle of all of this. And of course, you end up with the Battle of Trenton, which is a huge American victory, followed up by another important battle at Princeton, and then another battle at Trenton. And all of this kind of stops the bleeding from a disastrous couple of months for the Americans.
But that assumption failed to account for the spirit and determination of those fighting for American freedom. Not for the first time or the last, Washington overcame his detractors, leading a brilliant one-week campaign in the depths of winter that resulted in two precious victories at Trenton and Princeton. During the darkest hour.
Americans, we will cross a frozen river on Christmas night to come and kill you as you sleep. Not kidding. We've done it before. You've probably seen that meme.
Amidst fire, blood, and snow, the flickering light of the revolutionary flame blazed anew, marking the Battle of
And while all this is going on, you have Thomas Paine, who had written, previously written some important pamphlets that really kind of galvanized the American cause. Now he writes The American Crisis, and he starts with the words, "These are the times that try men's souls." Powerful stuff.
Island, and the campaign that followed. Not the end of the war for American independence, but rather barely the beginning.
All right, that was good. If you want to learn a whole lot more about this topic and you want to see my video about 1776, it starts at the beginning, gives all the details about exactly how they plan to defend Long Island and Manhattan, goes into details about these battles and covers a lot more than just the Battle of Long Island, and then covers the events afterwards. I'll put the link up on the screen here at the end, during the end screen, as well as down in the description. Check it out. Thanks for watching.